Welcome back everyone, thank you so much for clicking on this video. We're back again with another reaction, but this time I decided to do something different. I decided to watch a breakdown of the first episode of House of the Dragon. Now, full transparency, I've watched this reaction before, twice, but the thing is, there was some issues regarding the screen recording on my laptop, so it ended up not recording the way I wanted it to. So I'm gonna have to watch it again, and this time hopefully nothing goes wrong. It is slightly a bit tedious having to do the same video over and over again, but I wanted to try something new, so we'll see how this goes. This reaction video will be from New Rockstars. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that channel. Real quick, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, turn on your post notification, that way you'll always be updated when new video drops. And without any further ado, let's get started.
To New Rockstars, I'm Eric Boss, and this is a breakdown of the first episode of House of the Dragon, a Game of Thrones prequel series adapted from George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood. I actually started on this channel writing all of and eventually hosting the Game of Thrones analyses. And look how young and innocent that widow boy looked. He had no idea what laid before him, and how a career in YouTube would plague him with social disorders. But hey, I'm still excited to return to Westeros, not just to list a random number of Easter eggs, but really to dig into the deeper thematic
like
subtext,
I said before,
analyze the interesting cinematic
watched this
details,
twice,
and make that HBO flavored violence
and
even
yeah,
sexier,
so
and that
obviously
HBO
things are
flavored
going to be
sex
repetitive, and I
even
know
more
some of
violent.
the
This episode
I know
opens
some
with
of the things that
narration
he's
from
going to
adult
point out.
Rhaenyra Targaryen, who will be played by Emma Darcy.
But
in
I'll
future
still
episodes.
speak
She's recounting the
throughout
Great
the
Council of
breakdown.
101. The dynasty of Aegon the Conqueror went Aegon, then Aenys, then Maegor, and now Jaehaerys. Jaehaerys' first son Aemon had died 9 years prior, leaving behind Aemon's daughter Rhaenys, but she was the queen who never was, passed over for his second son Baelon, who had just died of a burst appendix. Warring factions began to rally, so Jaehaerys gathered this council to decide his heir and prevent civil war. But a difference from the book here, it did not come down to Viserys and Rhaenys. Rhaenys made a claim, but was immediately discounted due to her being a woman. It really came down to Viserys and Rhaenys.
Yeah, it's one of those olden times where women cannot be in power of certain things. Like I've watched this episode before. I've watched this episode obviously, but I found, like, you find out that Rhaenyra is the first queen who will sit on the Iron Throne. So it's quite unfortunate that that lady wasn't able to do that.
His son, Laenor Velaryon, whom we will meet later in this series. But here they emphasize Rhaenys getting slighted to connect this history to the similar succession drama that goes down with Rhaenyra. This setting is Harrenhal. You remember that from season 2 of Game of Thrones. It's the largest structure in Westeros that was chosen to house these 1,000 lords.
Yeah,
Notice how the
that.
Targaryens' hair blows in the wind, as this castle is in a ruined state, exposed to the elements. Why? Because a century earlier, Aegon's dragon Balerion torched this place to the ground. Really, the fact that Viserys was the final Targaryen prince to ride Balerion, who had died 7 years before this, was a major factor that led to him being chosen as Jaehaerys' heir. And now, with his hair blowing in this wind, he really does fit the bill of a dragon rider who torched places just like this. Also, a prince who uses conditioner. Maybe he's born with it. Or maybe
You guys remember that scene from
Rhaenyra's voiceover says,
from the final season of Game of Thrones?
House Targaryen stood at the height of its strength, with 10 adult dragons under its yoke.
Under its yoke? Yeah, right. Viserys reveals that the Targaryens' actual control of the dragons is an illusion. Also, yolk, as in that of an egg. An egg does become a key symbol later this episode. The scroll that Jaehaerys reads is stamped with the sigil of the Order of Maesters, a ring of chains.
Yeah,
Notice
the
how the
Maesters
Maesters of
always
this
have
series
rings.
wear chains that are more varied than the chains worn by the Maesters in the Game of Thrones series. Really, because each link is meant to represent mastery of a completely different field, kind of like merit badges. Though I don't know if these Maesters really deserve one for OBGYNing.
Yeah, no, they butchered
The
him.
opening title shows the Targaryen sigil.
Man, that scene was sort of hard to watch, because it just made you realize how the times were back then. There was no such thing as anesthesia, so in procedures like that, the woman felt all that pain. It's just scary.
The 3 dragon heads, and music from returning Game of Thrones composer Ramin Djawadi. Yeah, you'll notice the end has that same bass string trimmer that Djawadi would use in the House Targaryen theme in Game of Thrones right before a dragon would Dracarys.
Dracarys.
Yeah, that guy deserved it.
And you'll notice we don't really get a classic Game of Thrones style animated game board opening. However, I do think we get a nod to that.
Oh yeah, and another thing that I need to say is that I have watched the second episode of House of the Dragon, and it's pretty cool that the song from the original Game of Thrones actually returns. But except the visuals are different.
Thrones game board hidden interestingly in this episode later on. Then we jump ahead about a decade later as Rhaenyra rides her gold-colored dragon Syrax through the clouds. Yes, it took multiple seasons in Game of Thrones to get to dragons, but this one starts right off with him. A way bigger budget's always a beautiful thing. Notice on the Red Keep, some construction scaffolding is visible. This castle was completed decades earlier, finished by Maegor the Cruel, who also ordered the construction of the Great Dragon Pit, which you can see in the background here, still beautiful and intact. The ruins of this dragon pit were seen in Game of Thrones, where in season 7, Daenerys talks about how locking the dragons in this pit destroyed the Targaryens.
This place was the beginning of the end for my family. We weren't extraordinary without them. We were just like everyone else.
A reality that Rhaenyra admits using the same words at the end of this episode.
Without them, we're just like everyone else.
As Syrax lands, the Elder Dragon Keeper uses his staff to halt the younger one, and they speak in High Valyrian commands. Dohaeris, meaning I think to serve, as in Valar Dohaeris, but I think in this context maybe it means obey. Then Umbas, not really sure about that one, maybe it means in line. Rybas, which means listen or hear, and then later Niox,
And the research that
forward.
Eric Voss
Rhaenyra's friend is
does,
Alicent Hightower, who's
the research that Eric Voss does for these videos is pretty impressive. Like, I'm not sure if he's very familiar with the source material because he did mention the book before. Maybe he's read all of them, I'm not sure, but it's pretty impressive.
says,
Syrax is growing quickly. She'll soon be as large as Caraxes. That's almost large enough to settle too.
Caraxes is Daemon's dragon, nicknamed the Bloodworm for its extra long neck. You'll notice these dragons wear saddles, which makes sense for animals one would ride. Daenerys never used a saddle to ride Drogon in Game of Thrones, and when they asked how Daenerys could stay on this dragon, some people who worked on the show told my colleague Joanna Robinson over on the Ringerverse podcast that apparently it had to do with Drogon's spikes and the way a hat sits on a hook. I know. By the way, it's important to be on top of your mental health. But yes, Rhaenyra does mention a saddle for two in this episode, does end with a two-seated saddle, just on a different dragon, Caraxes, as Daemon and Mysaria leave. But notice how we cut back to Syrax here and realize that only then did this dragon turn back into the pit. Syrax was watching these two girls for their whole conversation, as if not trusting Alicent. The carriage rolls past a statue of Balerion the Black Dread.
Right.
Remember that was Aegon's dragon, last ridden by
I love
Viserys
how the
several
second
years
episode
prior.
ended.
These girls stroll through the Red Keep courtyard. This looks like the same location Cersei Lannister would later convert to the map floor in the later seasons of Game of
Definitely
Thrones.
remember
Over all of
that.
this, Jawadi's main Game of Thrones melody plays because, you know, HBO really needs us to remember the good times. In Queen Emma's chamber, incense burns, and a maester writes a desk. This guy's likely working on those moon charts that Melos will later update the king about. A Septa lights candles in front of wall art that depicts several characters apparently in an orgy. This chamber is covered in porny imagery. Maybe
Never
to
noticed that
encourage
artwork.
fertility. Some nurseries have like plush toys. This one has hand job art. Emma says,
This discomfort is how we serve the realm.
I'd rather serve as a knight and ride to bustling glory.
Very
while
tomboy
Rhaenyra
like.
is presented as a Daenerys figure, here she echoes Arya.
You will marry a High Lord and rule this castle.
No, that's not me.
Emma then says,
So adorable.
Childbed is our battlefield.
an important foreshadowing line, because later director Miguel Sapochnik will intercut between the bloody fight in the tourney and the even bloodier scenes of the childbirth. Because whereas tourneys are pretend wars that often end in a knight yielding, Emma didn't have that option. Her childbed was a literal battlefield where they tried to decide kings, and ultimately, like many battlefields, no one really walked away from it. On to the King's Small Council.
Well, I believe you might be looking up the wrong end.
Yes, Viserys finishes a dirty joke. Maybe even the punchline to Tyrion's never-ended joke from Game of Thrones.
I once brought a jackass and a honeycomb into a brothel.
Silence! What happened next?
But if you look
I
online,
actually
there
wanna
are
hear
actually
that
quite a
joke.
few really great possible answers to that one. Notice how Viserys eats a boiled egg. Now, a dragon egg will become a major plot point with Daemon later on this season, but this episode also draws a parallel to Viserys' unborn child and an egg.
After this miserable pregnancy, I wouldn't be surprised if I hatched an actual dragon.
Now, this is a cruel parallel, but Viserys eats a boiled egg here, while his baby egg does not survive and ends up getting cooked. Viserys' small council includes his hand, Otto Hightower, Master of Laws, Lionel Strong, Grand Maester Melos, Master of Coin, Lyman Breezebury, and Master of Ships, Corlys Valerion, Lord of Driftmark, his sigil the Seahorse. He's husband to Rhaenys. He and all the Valerians have silver hair because the Valerians are really kissing cousins to the Targaryens. Both Emma and Viserys
Yeah, the Targaryens and Lannisters are known for breeding You know what I mean? Like, it's something that you discovered in Game of Thrones, that hey, the Lannisters aren't the only families that does this whole incest thing, but also the Targaryens as well, and which is pretty like interesting, because in the first episode of Game of Thrones, we see the Lannisters, Jaime and Cersei do it, and in here we don't really see the Targaryens do it. I mean, it's a good thing that we don't see it, but I'm pretty sure eventually we will.
Smelled dragon on their daughter. I love this detail because it gives a new sensory weight to creatures that otherwise would just come off as VFX nothings. But like any riding animal, dragons would have a scent to them. I'm gonna guess it's smoky. Otto brushes off Corlys's warnings about Kragus the crab feeder in the Stepstones, and Otto tries to redirect to a lighter subject of the tourney, but since this tourney is in honor of Viserys' unborn son, the subject is actually even more serious, because notice how Corlys refuses wine from Rhaenyra so that he can listen closely to the Mellos' updates about the health and sex of that child. Later in the episode,
Yeah, you see, at that moment, I didn't like, when I was watching the episode, I didn't interpret it that way. I just thought, okay, maybe the guy isn't quite fond of Rhaenyra for some reason. Because if he didn't want to drink alcohol, if he didn't want more alcohol, he could have not drank. Like the cup could have been full, but he could have just, chose not to drink it. But I guess he was afraid of being tempted to. Because it makes sense. He wants to pay attention to what they're saying, so he want to be sober and not drink more wine.
You'll notice after Aemond's death, Corlys pours wine, but isn't surprised when Otto brings up the succession matter. He's like, motherfucker, I want to be sober for this stuff. Sir Harold Westerling takes Rhaenyra to the throne room.
We passed through the Red Keep's gates at Frostlight.
Does my father know he's here?
No.
Good.
We just learned quite a bit about Prince Daemon, his reputation preceding him. Daemon is a massive celebrity, yet somehow he managed to sneak into the Red Keep with very few noticing. Master of Sneaks! This tells us that Daemon has some pretty tight connection with the City Watch, that Viserys has a blind spot for his brother, that Rhaenyra likes having secrets with her uncle, and that Daemon might know some hidden passageways around the castle that others don't. Maegor the Cruel actually had the builders of this castle killed to keep its secrets, but maybe Daemon has learned some of them. Daemon sits on the Iron Throne.
God be good.
Notice how the Iron Throne is a larger nest of swords than it was in Game of Thrones. It's now closer to the description in George R. R. Martin's text, where it's supposed to be more of a mound of swords, but still to connect.
Man, that just looks even more uncomfortable to watch. To sit on. Look at that. Look at so many steps just for someone to sit on that, sit on the throne. I feel like it looks a bit excessive, if you ask me. That was probably the intention, for it to be over exaggerated and look very dramatic. But yeah, I think I prefer the live action one, the one that they adapted. In fact, not even this one in House of the Dragon. I think I prefer the one from Game of Thrones, because that one, it just seemed, it had its purpose. You knew what it was. The Iron Throne's a very unique chair. Here, like, it looks dangerous. Think about it. What if someone trips and falls, and then they fall on one of the blades? And what happens? So I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Connected with its look in Game of Thrones, they essentially just added a briar patch of swords surrounding the throne. But by designing it this way, you can see how Aegon recklessly just tossed more and more swords into that pile and just had Balerion melt it with dragonfire, making this a bit of a historical deconstruction to that grand design of the Targaryen dynasty. It actually seems more like a hasty scramble, as this sloppy dynasty more truly was. George R. R. Martin's The Rogue Prince said of Daemon, "In his day there was not a man so admired, so beloved, and so reviled in all of Westeros. He was made of light and darkness in equal parts. To some he was a hero, to others he was the blackest of villains." Similarly, notice how it takes us a moment to see Daemon in the light, as this uncle and niece speak in High Valyrian.
I forgot that it was called High Valyrian when I was watching the show, the episode.
The throne and the surrounding swords cast Daemon in shadow, giving him a deceitful look about him. Also notice how he leans forward and to his right, unlike his brother who leans back and leans on the left armrest when he sits on the throne. Daemon seems to instinctively know how to sit on this throne without getting cut, because their ancestor Aegon the Conqueror designed it in such a way, with exposed, still sharp swords, that would make it really uncomfortable to sit in, and make the Iron Throne not much of a desirable seat to want. Daemon gives his niece a necklace.
It's Valyrian steel. Like Doc's sister.
Dark Sister is the name of Daemon's sword, first carried by Aegon's sister Visenya. Notice how, as he yanks that necklace back, he grips it in a fist, like a chain wrapped around knuckles as a kind of weapon. Valyrian steel is extremely rare, since the art of forging it was lost in the Doom of Valyria. So to use it for jewelry, therefore, just seems insane. But symbolically, it links these two in a kind of relationship, or relationship that will be a weapon wielded against many others in this series.
Yeah, it's a very ancestral relationship. You know, like even when you're watching that scene, you could tell that it didn't feel very innocent. You know, like it didn't feel just okay, an uncle and niece just talking to each other. It just felt very Game of Thrones like. So, which is very weird, but you come to expect that.
Rhaenyra and Alicent sit in the Godswood. You can see the red leaves of the weirwood tree and its face with the bleeding eyes and the white trunk behind them. The weirwood trees represent the old gods. These were carved by the children of the forest, and many of these were cut down by the first men, who believed that the children's greenseers could use these trees' faces to spy on men. And the fact that Rhaenyra and Alicent have this little disagreement over the value of Rhaenyra's royal position in the presence of a weirwood tree is significant, as if the old gods are watching these two future queens begin to square off as friends. Alicent quizzes Rhaenyra about Princess Nymeria, the namesake of Arya's direwolf, and the warrior queen who led the Rhoynar and conquered Dorne and took Mors
Martell
cool
to
as
see
her
these
husband.
names
Turns
come
out
back.
Rhaenyra does know this history, but she tears the page out of the book, showing how she is unbound by historical precedent. But ironically, it is these kind of historical textbooks that bring Alicent in between Rhaenyra and her father Viserys. Viserys is treated for a wound.
It's a small cut from sitting the throne. It's nothing.
Otto tells Mellos to keep it quiet because getting cut from the swords of the Iron Throne is meant to be a bad omen for a ruler. As Daemon said earlier, you are all cursed with me. And notice this cut is on Viserys' lower left back, the side that Daemon leaned away from the Iron Throne when he sat on it. The Maester attendant says,
"It's a wound that refuses to heal, Grand Maester."
The unhealable wound is a Jungian archetype in fiction, a physical malady representing a spiritual curse that a character must bear. For Viserys, this unhealable wound is really a manifestation of the curse of his family's exploitation of dragon power and the folly of their dreams, which is really the deeper theme of this episode. Aemma tells Viserys that Rhaenyra declared the baby a girl.
She even named her
Dare I ask?
Visenya. She chose the dragon's egg for the cradle that she said reminded her of Vagar.
God be good. This family already has its Visenya.
Huh, remember, Rhaenyra told others that she wanted the baby to be a son for Viserys' sake. So we learn here that Rhaenyra actually lies, depending on who she is talking to. Now, Visenya was Aegon's sister wife, carrier of Dark Sister, writer of the dragon Vagar. Vagar, by the way, still alive, and it was Visenya who produced Maegor the Cruel.
Why do they
Both
keep
of these are really
recycling
considered to be
names?
the
It's
unstable branch of Targaryens. So
come up with a
Viserys
new
here
one.
is saying, we already had one Visenya in our history, but also Visenya's spirit lives on in Daemon. Viserys said he dreamed that the baby was a boy wearing Aegon's iron crown.
I heard the sound of thundering hooves, splintering shields and ringing swords. And I placed our son upon the Iron Throne. As the bells of the Grand Sept tolled, and all the dragons roared as one.
Dreams are incredibly important to the Targaryens, not just Aegon's dream that Viserys reveals later. The Targaryens first came to Westeros from Valyria because of a dream. Daenys, the dreamer, dreamt that Valyria would be destroyed in an apocalyptic event, and the people of Valyria mocked her and the family. But her father, Aenar, believed her, and the family fled to Dragonstone. 12 years after that, dreams confirmed. Valyria was destroyed in an earthquake and volcano, leaving the Targaryens as really the...
Can you imagine? Okay, so she had a dream that the whole place would be destroyed, and then 12 years later it happened. They listened, the father listened to her like years before the incident happened. Can you imagine if 10 it's 12 years, imagine 10 years go by, and then the dad's like, okay, so what about that whole catastrophe that you said was about to happen in your dream? You know, like it might have, it would cast doubt on someone even after 10 years had gone by. You know what I mean? Because 10 years is a long time. I wouldn't doubt someone if they said that the whole incident of the place being destroyed wasn't going to happen.
The only dragon riders left in the world, and the Targaryens walked away from that as a family obsessed with dreams and prophecy, a curse that will poison every generation of Targaryens after this. Daemon unleashes the city guard on King's Landing. These gold cloaks just cherry-pick targets and butcher them.
Savage.
Now, we will have to censor this visually, but I'm pretty sure the guy they castrate lets out a nervous fart when they strip off his pants. I swear we did not edit the audio of that. Damon's helmet is designed to look like a
I mean,
dragon.
it makes sense what they did, but I still think it was excessive. Okay, so for a thief, they chopped off the hand. For the rapist, they chopped off the genitals. And for a murderer, they killed them. You know, almost like an eye for an eye type of thing. Like, for example, if someone were to be a peeping Tom, you know, they'd spy on someone inside a house. Like, let's say a guy would spy on a lady while they're getting dressed, then maybe that would cause that guy to lose an eye. So that's what I think is the type of rules that they'd have here. I still think it's excessive. Yeah, I know the people are rapists and murderers, but maybe it's the fact that we saw it that makes it worse. Maybe if we just heard about it, it would have been a completely different story. And the fact that it's coming from this dude, Damon, who just gives you bad vibes already. Just within the first episode.
Its wings folded in, but this does not look like his dragon, Caraxes, which is red and has a long neck. Rather, this looks more like Balerion the Black Dread. So with his armor, Daemon is really trying to cast himself as an inevitable heir to Aegon's dynasty. The small council meets again, but this time with Daemon present, still smeared in blood. They mark their presence with balls on plates. The set decorator and production designer came up with these as a way of punching in for work, but I like how this gives each member's place setting and intentionality to it. 4 members to Viserys' left, Corlys at the far end, furthest away, having to shout to be heard, and then in the hand of the king, Otto alone on Viserys' right. His casual whispers the most effective. Now in the brothel with Daemon and Mysaria, we start this scene with other women peeping in at them through the slots in the wall. This indicates that nothing Daemon does at these brothels is private. And for us, it connects the viewer with the voyeurs rather than with the participants, because that's what we are. We're pervy little voyeurs. Mysaria offers,
I could bring in another. Could even arrange one with Silvera.
Yikes! This tells us that Daemon has, in the past, requested a partner who looks like she's related to him. So that moment with Rhaenyra wasn't so pure, was it? As Rhaenyra enters the king's booth at the tourney, notice Master of Coin Lyman Beesbury has a massive coin pouch in his crotch, obviously to place bets, but you know, that's a bit of a thirsty way of showing what's important to you, Lyman. But interesting that Rhaenyra is late, and notice Corlys signals with his hand right as she sneaks behind Rhaenys, as if these two might have some kind of connection. Now in the opening joust, Sir Criston Cole clashes with the Tarly Knight. All the major houses are represented here. You see a Baratheon stag, the Manderley eagle, the Stark direwolf, the Bolton flayed man, the Tully fish, a squire dressed with Lannister lions. On either side of the royal booth, notice are Valyrian seahorses, meaning Corlys' entourage has to sit outside the royal box. Poor guy, always getting bad seats. Daemon selects his opponent, Sir Gwaine Hightower of Old Town, making a dig at Otto of House Hightower. This is his son. Worried for her brother, Alicent bites her thumb, and later we see her picking at it till it bleeds. An interesting motif with some of these characters, always having some bloody fingers. Corlys and Rhaenys comment,
I wonder if this is how we should celebrate the birth of our future king. With wanton violence.
It's been 70 years since King Maegor's end. These nights are as green as summer grass. None have known real war.
These violent delights intercut with the true battlefield of this episode, Emma's childbed. Mellos tells Viserys that he must either sacrifice Emma to try to save the child or lose them both.
A technique is taught at the Citadel, which involves cutting directly into the womb to free the infant.
To free the child?
It's like
tough
saying decision to be put in.
Trapping the child. Medical malpractice.
Yeah,
While Emma screams initially.
It's such a tough spot to be put in. Like, either you save your unborn child or you save your wife. And what's interesting here is that what if, I'm not saying he should have, but what if he chose to save his wife? Was that possible? Because to me, it seemed like his only choices were either they both die or there's a higher chance that the child will live. I'm curious, what if he chose to save his wife? Like, was that an option? Because obviously if he chose to do that, then unfortunately the baby would die.
Bleed over into the shouts of the tourney. When we cut back to her later, her screams are muted, while all we hear are the sounds of the fighting. It's like her whole identity is being muted and cruelly snuffed out. This brutal realism contrasts with Sapochnik's stylized shots of the joust, using the dividing pole as a camera track line to follow Daemon along as his back grinds along against it. I also appreciate the contrast between these two warriors. There's a lot of close-ups of the fine armor of Daemon and his horse, contrasting with the simpler and scuffed armor of Sir Criston. Ultimately, Daemon is brought down by his showboating. While Daemon was more focused on his ego and the crowd, Criston never took his eyes off the prince. Victorious, Criston removes his helmet.
Gods, his daughter. Dornish.
Another change from George R. R. Martin's text. Originally, Sir Criston's a Stormlander, but this series makes him a Dornish, son of a steward of Lord Dondarrion, making the southern realm of Dorne even more important to the series. With its
The way I understand it, like the way I remember from Game of Thrones, is that the Starks, the Baratheons, the Lannisters, the Boltons, as well as who? As well, okay, I forgot the other houses, but they were usually white people. You know, from what I remember, they usually cast white actors to portray those characters. And as for the people from Dorne, as well as, oh, the Greyjoys as well, part of that family. But yeah, the Dornish people, and the whatever Khal Drogo's group were called, I forgot their names. Those were people of color. So I'm not sure. Maybe this Dornish dude is a person of color, but not really. I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
Its proximity to the Triarchy's advances in the Stepstones, and Rhaenyra's knowledge of Nymeria's marriage to Mors Martell of Dorne. I assume that's going to come up. Summoning some inner authority, Rhaenyra commands Syrax to ignite the funeral pyres.
Dracarys.
Actress Millie Alcock rolls that first R, unlike the way Daenerys would say it.
Dracarys.
Which makes sense. 200 years earlier, High Valyrian wouldn't have been as watered down. Otto gathers a small council to discuss Viserys' succession, but we now see Daemon watching from the shadows.
Daemon has ambition, yes, but not for the throne. He lacks the patience for it.
Master of Sneaks! This makes us wonder if every time Daemon was absent, he might have actually been listening from this hidden spot. Viserys snaps.
My wife and son are dead! I will not sit here and suffer crows that come to feast on their corpses!
Yeah, nice word choice working in an
this
allusion
was
to A Feast for
inappropriate.
Crows.
The
Otto
timing.
seals a message to send to Old Town, presumably to set some plans to wed his daughter Alicent to the king. He creepily instructs her to comfort the king in his chambers.
You might wear one of your mother's dresses.
Ugh, yikes, the men of this
Pimping.
world. Viserys toys with this carved model. This depicts Valyria, his ancestral home, meaning he must have recreated it from his dreams. With its multiple tiers and layers, it's
Really
all part of the
impressive
same
if he
base. Makes me wonder if
recreated
these
all of
kinds
that.
of models could end up being part of that Game of Thrones opening title game board. Was that all carved by poor Viserys in a sad, lonely train set? Now, to me, the most interesting moment of the episode, Daemon's speech in the brothel is intercut with Otto reporting it back to the small council.
The gods give just as the gods take away.
He toasted Prince Balon,
To the king's son.
styling him the heir for a day.
Now, the editing made it seem like we were going to cut back to Daemon for that last part, but we hear Otto say it. Why didn't they cut to Daemon for that? Well, notice how Daemon doesn't deny saying in the next scene, but he doesn't explicitly admit to it either.
I mean,
Heir for a day.
I believe he said
Did
it.
you say it?
He says, I mean, we grieve differently or we mourn differently.
We can still mourn in our own way, Your Grace.
George R. R. Martin wrote Fire and Blood as an
Doesn't even
in-universe
sound
subjective
convincing.
historical
Doesn't even
text
sound
compiled
sincere.
by an Archmaester from accounts from Septon Eustace, who is biased because he doesn't approve of Rhaenyra, and accounts from a fool named Mushroom, who gives his own biased, salacious anecdotes. Like all of history, it's just based on what people say. We don't really know what the objective truth was. And I bring up this detail with Otto and Daemon because we don't know for sure if Daemon actually said those precise words of heir
Right?
for a day in the brothel. But he
I think he said it because if someone accuses you of saying something false, especially something as vile as what he said or inappropriate as what he said, if you're called by the king to answer for this, it would make sense for you to clear your name. You know what I mean? Like these are very, like it's a very heartless thing for him to say. So maybe if you didn't say it, then tell the king, you know, clear your name. Don't, I don't know, it's what I would have done.
may have said something similar, or he may have said something even worse. Maybe he just feels guilty for being in the brothel at all. And the Master of Sneaks knows that Otto had him followed and spied on, and nothing he says in this moment is going to calm his brother. Also, he's kind of pissed at his brother. Now, Viserys clutches his sword, Blackfire. This is a Valyrian steel sword of Aegon. Notice how its pommel has a 7-pointed star of the 7. Daemon says,
"You're weak, Viserys. And that Council of Leeches knows it.
Council of Leeches, a fitting term, as leeches were brought up as a possible remedy with the Maesters earlier to treat Viserys' unhealable wound. Physical leeches on Viserys' wound from the throne, metaphorical leeches on the king's waning influence. And Viserys cuts himself again, this time his pinky finger on the armrest. Now it's interesting to note that both of his wounds are on his left side, the side of his body that Daemon sits at the small council table.
Why do you cut me so deep?
Viserys summons Rhaenyra to the skull of Balerion the Black Dread, and he tells her,
The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion. They are a power man should never have trifled with. One that brought Valyria its doom.
I love it. Viserys is echoing one of my favorite quotes from Game of Thrones, spoken by Varys.
Power resides where men believe it resides.
Very wise man.
It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
Viserys says,
You are the very best of your mother.
And I like how this line plays over a shot of Alicent sewing Rhaenyra's dress on and holding her like a mother would, as Alicent is slowly transitioning from Rhaenyra's best friend to her stepmother. Daemon introduces Mysaria to his dragon Caraxes. I love the breath from the dragon's mouth blows back Daemon's hair. It's just a nice practical interaction between the physical environment and the VFX, just to make this dragon more than a CGI effect. But Viserys dispels the narrative that Aegon conquered Westeros purely out of ambition. Really, Aegon was motivated by a dream.
And just as Daenerys foresaw the end of Valyria, Aegon foresaw the end of the world of men. It is to begin with a terrible winter, gusting out of the distant north.
I love that when Viserys mentions the North. Of course, that's when we finally cut to the Starks, the begrudging Rickon Stark, and of course...
Yeah, it's really cool to see Stark finally. And the way he was, pledging his allegiance basically to Rhaenyra, it looked very reluctant, like he didn't want to do it. Because the Starks, they strike me as very proud people. And like from what we saw on the show, like they were very proud people because they were people in power. So it becomes a bit difficult to bow down to someone else, especially someone else who has a higher authority than you.
A reminder of the Stark words, winter is coming. Now, Viserys says that Aegon saw in his dream the threat that we would later identify as the White Walkers and concluded that a Targaryen must sit on the Iron Throne to unite all of Westeros against this northern threat.
Aegon called his dream the Song of Ice and Fire.
And yes, that is Aegon's Valyrian steel dagger, the same dagger that Arya Stark will use to slay the Night King, and the one that was given to the assassin to try to kill Bran Stark years earlier. This dagger is freaking cursed, and of course it's going to play a very important role in episodes of this series as the Civil War unfolds. But it's just interesting to learn that Aegon was motivated by the same doom that the characters in Game of Thrones will face. However, his prophecy was flawed when you think about it. Targaryens like Dany and Jon certainly play an important role in defeating the White Walkers, but while Jon was king in the north, a Targaryen did not sit on the Iron Throne when that happened. Cersei was sitting on it. Really, it was Arya who dealt the killing blow, and the throne is just going to end up getting destroyed while Bran Stark gets named the king in the aftermath. But to me, this flawed thinking is just another example of the curse of the Targaryens being their own dreams. I mean, lots of things brought down the Targaryens. Of course, their own dragons, each other, their diminishing shadows. But at the root of it all, I think their paranoia over their prophecies, the mistaken belief that they must be the heroes of this story, is what drove them mad. So now, in this series, we're going to get to see what happens when madmen convinced that their fire is what will keep us safe, compete to see who can burn everything down the fastest. This episode closes with a mirror of the Succession Council that opened the episode, but this time a supposed correction of that historical wrong that denied Rhaenys her claim. Now a woman is named heir, breaking historical precedent in a significant way. But since this succession was born out of the Targaryen curse, like the Lords of Harrenhal, the only thing these heirs of the dragon will inherit will be ashes. You can follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter at EAVOS. Follow New Rockstars for more analysis of everything you love. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Yeah, that was a great breakdown. I'm hoping that I won't have to re-record this again. This is the third time now. I've watched that video for 3 times. As usual, Eric Voss, I have watched New Rockstars videos before, but as usual, Eric Voss does a great job at what he does, where he makes it like he's more familiar with the source material than I am. I've never read a single Game of Thrones book or anything related to Game of Thrones before. Otto was basically pimping out his daughter. Like he was planting the seeds earlier on. Like I said, I've watched the second episode, so I know what his plan is. I know what ends up happening by the end of the second episode. So spoiler alert. His plan kind of works, but at what cost? Alicent and Rhaenyra. How's that relationship gonna work? You can't. Like Daemon is a very unlikable character. Like they established that in the first episode. He's kind of sadistic, the way he handled that whole situation with those criminals. Yeah, again, I know some of them are rapists and murderers, but it seemed as if he did it out of enjoyment. To me, it felt like he's prioritizing hurting people for his enjoyment than actually punishing people, or punishing people. Curious to see what else happens in the show, like what happened to the third episode, between Alicent and Rhaenyra and their relationship now, since Otto sort of ruined it, and also the king of Viserys also ruined it as well. But yeah, that's all for this video. Please tell me in the comment section below what you thought about this breakdown.